The crying sounded even louder out of doors. It was as if all the pain in the world had found a voice.
It's time to make human-chimp hybrids. The Humanzee is both scientifically possible and morally defensible. That was the headline of the article, which caught my eye one workday morning. I use Firefox. They often show you a little slideshow on the start page of articles that they think might interest you. I'm not sure how they got it into their heads that this article would interest me, but it turned out to be a very hot article, as it was online, and still is, at the Nautilus website. The Nautilus is a magazine whose tagline is Science Connected, and from their FAQ, I was able to find this information. They challenge, quote, the reader to consider the connecting tissue that runs through the sciences and connects them to philosophy, culture, and art. So that's pretty cool. It's a magazine which tries to be interdisciplinary, and I do enjoy any publications that try to connect different areas of academia and thoughts. But let me say that was not really what was going through my mind as I read that most controversial article title. Another interesting thing about this article, as I was looking through it, because at this point there was no turning back, the author is a guy named David P. Barash. He is a professor of psychology emeritus at the University of Washington. So let's talk about the article real quick, and I promise this does relate very strongly to our subject here, and that is my book review from Rereading The Island of Doctor Moreau by H.G. Wells. Barash's main points here, as he talks about his thesis that the Humanzee is both scientifically possible and morally defensible, his main points here are, I would say, threefold. His first is that if we could make a human-chimp hybrid, it would increase humans' empathy for animals, telling us more about our supposed ancestors, if you believe in Darwinism, and teaching human beings their true nature. His words, not mine. His second point was that he believes it is scientifically possible, it just needs government's okay, and he cites an example here of a Soviet scientist, Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, who in the 1920s allegedly attempted to create human and chimpanzee chimeras, basically through artificial insemination, which was this scientist's specialty. And now here's where I'll break just for a moment to let you know that Barash's use of information in this article is not what I would call scholarly. He only gives 2 sources in his whole article, and there's no notes for this whole story about Ivanov. I was looking at some of the articles online, which I assume is where Barash got this information. He does mention that Ivanov supposedly found 5 female human volunteers to be the bearers of these hybrid creatures. But the same articles suggest or refer to the allegations or the possibility that Ivanov was going to test it out on African women against their knowledge or will, or at least without asking them. And Barash doesn't mention that less savory possibility of Ivanov's career. And altogether, the more I started to read about Ivanov, there is some question how far his experiments went, let's put it that way. I found some interesting articles by the Smithsonian. There was a discussion about Ivanov and his research center, or the one he worked at, in a newsletter by Brown University. And there's a whole Wikipedia discussion about how much of this can we say was true, how much of it was, questionable or not fully substantiated. So I'll link to those articles in my show notes, so please check those out. I don't think we should take anybody's word for historical events unless there's some good scholarly research or large quantity of separate eyewitness accounts to verify what happened or what somebody did way in the past. We're talking about 100 years ago. And of course, there was a lot of material that was, closed off from the public by the USSR. So again, there's always a level of question how much we can just take to be true. And I think it's just worth mentioning because to me, this is a very, as I've probably indicated already, this is a very horrifying notion that someone would try to create human-chimp hybrids. And I do think that if we're going to be looking at historical precedents for this, to have a context, or let alone, any kind of justification for such experiments, that we need to be careful about where we're getting that information from, and that we're not just spawning more science fiction. And then finally, Barash's third point in this article, and the one that he really lands as his punchline, is that his main motive here, and the main hope out of this proposal, for him it would be to be able to disprove, or to show some kind of physical proof, I guess, that humans are not created in God's image. And he ends with this huge spiel against people that believe humans have some divine footprint upon their being. So he envisions the human-chimp hybrid as being sort of a way to disprove that belief. So yeah, that's his main motivation here, according to his article. Again, going back to Soviets, if we must, it kind of reminds me of the communist campaign, not just in Russia, but in many countries, to make religion secondary to party politics and belief, party thought. So I'm not too surprised that Barash ended on that note. It's just, well, make of it what you will from whatever perspective you're reading this information from. Ultimately, by the time I finished this article, I was pretty much expecting it to be a joke, some kind of really hardcore satirical piece like Jonathan Swift's essay, and I couldn't believe that anyone would seriously put forth this idea, especially someone with academic standing, a professor of psychology at a major university. So yeah, I was convinced this was a joke, it was satire, someone trying to make a point. But then I went all the way down to the end of the article, and there's this note that says the following. This article is somewhat modified from a chapter in Barash's next book. The book is called Through a Glass Brightly, Using Science to See Our Species as It Really Is. And it says this book will be published this summer, 2018, by Oxford University Press. I don't know if I will be reading this book. What I will say is I find all three of his points to be highly arguable against. I think you could make pretty strong opposing viewpoints to all 3 points. I think some of his logic is certainly questionable, and fortunately there are comments on the article, so if you really want to get into that side of things, go check out the article, read the comments. People were pretty unanimous. This is not a great idea. And I'll tell you someone else who seemed to indicate this was probably not a good idea, and that is British author H.G. Wells. Wells, it should be mentioned here, was very optimistic about the role of science, but he also wrote a book of one of the greatest, what I find to be a cautionary tale against what Barash is proposing, and that book is The Island of Doctor Moreau. 3 things to know about H.G. Wells. First, he was born in England in 1866, and just to give you some context, that means Jules Verne was in his late 30s. The great French author and really one of the fathers of science fiction as we know it today. Verne, of course, wrote from a French perspective, and you'll notice that in many of his books. He's famous for a series called The Extraordinary Voyages, and really a prolific writer of scientific and speculative fiction. Mostly scientific, though. Verne tried very hard to be up to date on his research, even though some people now probably think it's not that sciencey. But for the time, he really had a great deal of respect for science and the intention to present stories that were at least somewhat plausible, even as they were fanciful. Yeah, that's Verne. That's how old Verne was at the same time Wells was born. And it's kind of interesting that Wells wrote far more on the speculative side of things than Verne. I feel like the two authors complement each other really well, and you don't really have to choose one or the other. It's really apples and oranges here between their writing styles, between their stories, and the kind of things they were trying to talk about and promote in their books. But that could be a whole nother topic. let's get back to Wells here. The second thing you should know about him is he studied biology in college, so he does have some science background. He became a teacher even while he was still a student, and he began to publish his writing in part to pay the bills. Wells would become a highly successful writer in several genres, and he's remembered most today for his science fiction, so great classics like The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, and The Invisible Man. And I've read all of those. I enjoyed each of them in different ways. Oh, The First Men in the Moon, that's another good one. So yeah, check out his other science fiction books if you have not. All those ones I've mentioned, I think they were fairly worth reading, and it's very interesting to see how he approaches science fiction in sort of a mystery or thriller way, which is very modern, I think, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Third thing to know about H.G. Wells is he identified as a socialist very strongly. For a time, he was a member of the Fabian Society, and ultimately he was a proponent of New World Order, or some kind of universal government, universal state. And he kind of envisioned that as being a solution to world problems. And keep in mind, this is someone who lived through World War I and all of the massive atrocities that occurred around the turn of the century there. So, we can agree or disagree with Wells, but many people of his day were putting forth ideas of what they think would make the world a better place to ensure that no such wars would happen again. And this was, I think, Wells' solution to that problem. The Island of Doctor Moreau was published in 1896, so Wells was then about 30, and it's about a guy named Edward Prendick who is adrift on the ocean in the Pacific, and he gets picked up by a little vessel that's en route to Hawaii. It seems like a really good thing. He's, about to starve here, but he's finally picked up by a ship. As it turns out, this ship is not maybe the best or the most ideal ship to be picked up by. The captain is a very angry man and not happy with his passengers, which are basically an assortment of animals in cages. And there is one man in charge, a young man named Montgomery. Montgomery's sinister-looking servant is also taking care of these animals. So by the time they get to Montgomery's destination, the captain is just fed up with the mess of the animals, and he wants everybody off. He's done not taking any more passengers, and he wants Prendick off as well. So they reach this island, which Montgomery calls a, quote, biological station of a sort, and Prendick is about to be tossed overboard because the captain is that fed up. But at Montgomery's mercy, Prendick is allowed to stay on the island, and there he meets Dr. Moreau, who is a scientist whose specialty is making human-animal chimeras. One interesting difference between the type of experimentation Barash was proposing in his article versus what Moreau does is, while Barash's suggestions or examples lean towards lab-grown experiments on the cellular level, he talks about stem cell research, Dr. Moreau takes a very different approach. His is simply plastic surgery. He is a plastic surgeon of very high ability, and he doesn't have any particular motive for creating these animals, these creatures. Basically, he's trying to test himself and see what's the maximum elasticity of form and being. How far can he go to make a hybrid creature? And that's really his one goal. Is he's noticed the results of his experiments are animals that are human-like, but they tend to revert back to their bestial ways. And he's trying to figure out, what can I do to make them stay human, or what he calls human. So that is how our book begins, and as you can imagine, Prendick is not thrilled about being on this island. I mentioned earlier that H.G. Wells approached science fiction in much the same way you might approach a detective novel or a thriller, and I feel like The Island of Doctor Moreau is probably the best example of this, except perhaps The Invisible Man. Maybe that one's a little more like a detective novel, but most of The Island of Dr. Moreau takes place on a short timeline, and events are told very sequentially. So you get the feeling that Prendick is relating events as if modified from journal entries. So that's a very effective way to bring you into the story and make you feel the types of emotions he's going through. It's a desert island, which is always a harrowing scenario, and Moreau makes the sinister joke that it's like Bluebeard's chamber, full of secrets. And if you know the story of Bluebeard, you know that that doesn't end well. And so Moreau is at that point where he's resorting to dark humor and not even really realizing it. It's just all very offhand to him. On this island, it's the scientist who makes the laws. He's not fettered by any government regulation. That in itself is sort of a commentary on the kinds of points Barash's article was making. Ultimately, though, the scientist makes laws which he imposes on the beast people, as they're called, the results of his experiments. And the beast people teach themselves a chant which reminds them of Moreau's laws. That is a very unsettling piece of the story because it's just another indication that in every place there's going to be some kind of hierarchy, whether we intend for it to happen or not. So you're getting almost a kind of Lord of the Flies vibe there, as the beast people are subjugated to Moreau's word. Just as the article that I read points to Ivanov as some kind of real-life precedent, Moreau himself claims that what he's doing has a level of normalcy and that he wasn't the first person to do this sort of thing. In fact, Moreau, or Wells through Moreau, makes a literary reference, and this would be morbid to anyone else, but again, Moreau finds it fairly normal. He mentions the Victor Hugo novel called L'homme qui rit, and it means the man who laughs. I was immediately sidetracked by that reference because whenever I find literary references in books, I have to go look it up, learn more about it. And of course, in this case, I was very much interested to know what was Hugo writing about. I didn't know he wrote a book about anything like what's going on Moreau's island. So it turns out the novel features this gang called the Comprachicos, and it's a gang which supposedly bought children, altered their physical appearance, and sold them as jesters and clowns. As horrifying as that sounds, there is fortunately not a lot of evidence to show that anything like that ever existed in real life. In fact, I found an article from 1913 by this college lecturer named John Kaiser, and Kaiser did a pretty good investigation on Victor Hugo's novel, trying to figure out if there was any historical basis for it. I read the article, couldn't see that he found any evidence of its truth. And I will link to that research by Kaiser in my show notes, so check that out if you are also interested. But what Kaiser did find was one or two sources, including the Encyclopedia Britannica, which at the time suggested that ancient Romans practiced artificial dwarfing of children, stunting their growth on purpose. This was completely news to me, and I was pretty horrified to read that. Again, who knows how well documented that is, or, where Britannica got that, but just the idea is horrifying. I found some related articles on the subject of this whole realm of topics, and I will link to those in the notes, but it's just mind-boggling that humans can go so low and hurt other humans in such horrific ways. But that in itself is another topic. But here certainly we see some of that in what Moreau is doing to animals. The kind of abuse he inflicts on them is terrifying. So if that's something that really affects you, you may want to be aware of that before reading this book, or you may want to skip it if it's the kind of thing that is hard for you to handle. So going back to Barash's first point, which was that creating hybrid human chimps would increase our empathy for animals. What I'm finding here, at least on Moreau's Island, in this vision of such a situation which Wells is showing here, I'm not finding that any of the characters developed increased empathy for animals. The predominant emotions on the island are anarchy, fear, and just desperate desire for survival. The captain is a great example. The captain of the ship, he was repulsed by the animals and the one hybrid that he knew. And Prendick, who is our narrator and who was a student of natural history, he's both horrified and fascinated, but he never comes to some kind of light bulb moment where he connects with the creatures. It just doesn't happen. What really happens is he just notices their animal behaviors all the more and how different they are. Even while there are similarities to some humans, which he does talk about, on the whole, he sees the animal more than the human. Montgomery is a former biology student in this book, and he, as Moreau's assistant, has certainly come to a level of acceptance of the situation of these experiments, but he certainly uses alcohol as his way of dealing with what he does not naturally approve of or can't really accept on a natural level. And he himself becomes more animal-like rather than becoming a human who's more empathetic. So there we see another reason that this would not be a great thing in society, through people like Montgomery who would change to become more animalistic. Finally, there's Moreau, the scientist who is driven out of England and who has found the perfect freedom to practice his so-called science here on an island. Moreau is the epitome of brute force. He has no compassion. He claims full ownership over what he has formed out of the various creatures. Again, we don't see a great love for what he's created. They are just merely products of what he is experimenting with. Throughout the book, there were racist remarks by all three characters comparing these creatures to various ethnic groups, real human ethnic groups, and I don't see that the characters were positively transformed by their experiences on the island. In fact, quite the reverse. And you might say, well, yeah, but Moreau is doing things in a different way than what Barash was talking about. You know, Barash is talking about starting out from some kind of lab experiment. But again, even after Prendick gets past the initial terror of what Moreau is doing through plastic surgery, there's still this huge gap between him and the beast people. And this is really the case for all three characters except Montgomery, and I already mentioned the direction that Montgomery goes. So really, I think Wells' story is still a great cautionary tale. I don't think that there's any redemption or greater good that comes out of creating a population of human-animal hybrids. The creatures suffer. It's animal testing to the extreme here. The scientist is, or becomes, amoral, in the vein of Wolf Larsen, whom we talked about in one of my early episodes. Other characters become whip-wielding slave masters because they have to control these animals, which have only partial understanding of what's going on. So the entire environment becomes one of fear, subjugation, and segregation. There's just no indication that that translates to any kind of good for society as a whole. Alright, so thanks for sticking with me as I related a real-life article to a very much fictional book. And I will just say that I have not tried here to present a truly, scholarly opposing viewpoint to David Barash's article with a fictional book. I don't think you can do that. What I'm trying to do instead is explain how Wells, through the Island of Doctor Moreau, examined these same ideas and how they might play out in a fictional setting. And while this is by no means a scholarly argument, I do think that through classic literature, through fiction, we have seen in the past how fiction influences or was influenced by real-life events. Take We, for example, by Yevgeny Zamyatin. The very first episode where I talked about that Russian dystopian classic, you get to examine things that could potentially happen in real life through a fictional context. And what that gives us is a way to think about what might happen in the real life if certain things were allowed to happen. Because human behavior is fairly predictable, and we can find truth even in fiction, because fiction is written by humans that have a shared experience and a shared history. I do think that we need to remind ourselves of why this is a bad idea, and I think Wells' book can help us do that. Again, I will link to some articles that talk a little bit about things people have done in real life history, which are not so far away from this topic of human-animal hybrids. Just the whole topic of humans controlling other humans or animals in this specific way and shaping what kind of beings they are. I think it's worth reading about, and there's much more you could read about there in real life history. They're pretty hard topics, but ones we should always keep on the back burner, because ultimately we need to turn to history to learn our lessons. Fiction is just one of those ways that reminds us of our history.